In 1972, a 15-year-old girl left home on her bike and mysteriously went missing. The very next day, she was discovered in a field, prompting the police to begin their search for the person responsible. They couldn't find any clues, and the case remained unsolved for many years. After nearly 49 long years, the person responsible was finally identified. Julie Ann Hanson was born in 1957 in Naperville, a peaceful suburb of Chicago known for its tranquility and safety, far removed from the city's hustle and bustle. She was part of a close-knit and loving family, which included caring parents, an older sister, and a younger brother. Julie had a deep passion for singing and regularly participated in her school's band and the local choir every weekend. She also devoted her Sundays to attending church and Sunday school. On July 7th, 1972, when Julie Ann Hanson was 15 years old, she was getting ready to attend her younger brother's baseball game. To get there, she borrowed her brother's bicycle from their home and started riding to the field, which was just a few miles away. However, she never arrived at the game, and as the evening wore on, she never returned home. During this time, Julie's parents were away and had plans to return in a few days. Her older sister Jill, who was 18 at the time, was responsible for looking after Julie and her younger brother. Jill only realized Julie was missing the following day. It's possible that Jill assumed Julie was in her room or had spent the night at a friend's house. During those years, people felt much safer, with far fewer concerns about their loved one's safety due to the significantly lower crime rates compared to today. On July 8, Jill contacted her parents, informing them that Julie had not returned home. She tried contacting Julie's friends, but none of them had seen her. This is when Jill decided to reach out to the police for help. The police initiated a search, and soon dozens of local residents volunteered to assist in the efforts. After a few hours of searching, the police discovered Julie's bicycle lying by the side of the road. There were no signs of Julie nearby, so the search efforts continued on in the area. Unfortunately, a grim and unsettling discovery awaited them. They discovered Julie's body in a field only a few dozen yards away from her bicycle, approximately 1.5 miles from her home. During those years, this area wasn't densely populated with residential structures. Instead, it was mostly fields filled with tall corn stalks. Medical experts determined that Julie had suffered 36 sharp object wounds and had been subjected to violence. They also managed to uncover traces of the alleged killer's semen, but the available evidence was limited as DNA analysis was not as advanced as it is today. DNA analysis didn't become a prominent tool in forensic science until about 2 decades later. Nevertheless, experts preserved the semen sample and sent it to a laboratory to be stored. The crime scene yielded no substantial evidence, forcing detectives to search for the killer without any clear leads. They made the decision to keep the fact that the girl had been subjected to violence concealed from the public. This was a tactic often used by investigators, as it allowed them to potentially identify the perpetrator later. The reasoning behind this was that only the actual killer would be aware of such specific details, and there was a chance that they might accidentally reveal this information during an interrogation or a private conversation. The detectives made efforts to locate witnesses, closely examining individuals with prior criminal records in the area. Unfortunately, these efforts yielded no leads, and they soon found themselves at a complete standstill in the investigation. A breakthrough in the case came about 2 decades later in 1992, when the police arrested a 42-year-old man named Major Morris Jr. He was charged with the murder of another young girl that had occurred in 1973 in the nearby town of Oswego, just around 10 miles away. In that case, the body of a 16-year-old girl named Roberta Anderson was discovered, bearing 60 wounds from a sharp object and signs of violence. Morris had been a suspect initially, but without the availability of DNA analysis at the time, it was exceedingly difficult to establish his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. At that time, Major Morris Jr. resided not far from the victim and worked as a garbage man. Just 2 days after the murder, he moved to another location, raising suspicions about his involvement. To avoid suspicion, he quickly got married and had 2 daughters, living an ordinary life in the early 1990s. In 1992, detectives reopened the case when they obtained a DNA sample from Morris, which matched the sample found on Roberta's body. Morris's family members were completely shocked, and their shock deepened when he actually confessed to the murder of Roberta. He was also accused of the murder of an 18-year-old girl in 1978, which had occurred in the town of Glen Ellen. After a lengthy investigation, Morris also confessed to this crime. He was sentenced to serve 100 to 200 years in prison. These locations were in the suburbs of Chicago, much like the Julie Hanson case, and the details of these murders closely mirrored each other, involving multiple blows with a sharp object and acts of violence. Even the distances from the victims' homes to where the bodies were found were really similar. The investigators in Julie's case were convinced that Morris was the one responsible for her murder. They promptly requested a DNA analysis, which took a few months. When the results came in, Morris's DNA did not match the material found on Julie's clothing. There was no longer any doubt that he was not connected to this 20-year-old investigation. At one point, a serial killer by the name of Henry Lee Lucas confessed to Julie Hanson's murder, but the investigators were skeptical of his statement. After Lucas's arrest, he made claims of involvement in more than 100 incidents, but only 11 of these could be verified. Lucas had a history of falsely taking responsibility for crimes committed by others, and a brief conversation with the detectives quickly revealed that he had no connection with the case. Another person who drew the police's attention was Bruce Lindahl, a serial killer who operated in the suburbs during the 70s and 80s. Lindahl had faced accusations of 12 murders, but only 2 could be definitively proven. He met his end in 1981 when he attacked an 18-year-old boy in Naperville named Charles Robert Huber Jr. Lindahl attacked Huber with a knife, stabbing him a total of 28 times. During the attack, Huber resisted, causing Lindahl to stab himself in the thigh. This resulted in heavy bleeding, from which he died right beside his deceased victim. In 2020, investigators took a sample of his DNA and compared it with Julie's sample, but unfortunately, they did not match. Another year went by, and in June 2021, the police department held a press conference. The detectives made a significant announcement. After 49 long years, they had finally identified the killer of Julie Ann Hanson. As science caught up, the police finally caught up to 76-year-old Barry Lee Whelpley. It turned out that in 1972, when Barry was 27 years old, he lived just a mile and a half away from Julie's house. Throughout the entire 49-year investigation, he had never been considered a suspect, and the police were unaware of his existence. Barry spent his entire working life as a welder, had been married 3 times, and had 2 daughters. At the time of his arrest, he and his current wife were residing in another state. Detectives wouldn't have been able to locate him using traditional methods, but modern technology provided a different avenue. They decided to send a DNA sample from Julie's killer to a specialized laboratory that focused on genetic genealogy. This was their final opportunity to uncover the truth. They needed to transfer the entire sample, which weighed just a minuscule 1/1,000,000th of a gram. Despite being stored in the laboratory, this tiny piece of evidence deteriorated over time, losing its properties, which posed a significant challenge for the expert working with it. They used DNA samples to find potential relatives of the unknown criminal. This involved sifting through a list of thousands of individuals who might share a family connection with them. They utilized not only the FBI's registry of convicted individuals, but also public databases where people could upload their DNA samples to find relatives. Astonishingly, one of Barry's relatives had used this method, which eventually revealed his identity. At the moment, Barry is in custody awaiting trial with bail set at $10 million. Given the presence of his DNA on the victim's clothing, there's virtually no chance of escaping punishment. However, certain issues during the investigative process have caused delays in the trial. According to Barry's lawyers, the police violated the law during a search of his house. First, they failed to read him his rights while questioning him. Additionally, when Barry's wife returned home, the police recorded their conversation with her husband on their chest cameras, which was also a violation. The judge had to exclude these recordings from the case file. While these issues may not significantly impact the case's outcome, they have led to delays in the trial, which is a concern given Barry's age, as he may not live long enough to see the verdict. Julie's parents never learned who was responsible for her tragic death. Her father passed away in 2009 and her mother in 2019. On the contrary, her brother and sister attended a press conference and expressed their gratitude to the investigators for their tireless work. They had long lost hope that the truth would ever come to light. Barry's relatives were shocked by the news, unable to fathom how a seemingly loving family man could hide such a terrible secret for nearly 5 decades. Despite Barry's clean criminal record, investigators are now reviewing other local cases for potential links, aided by modern technologies capable of solving old cases.